Stephen, thanks very much for having a chat with me today in the glorious California weather.
Sure is. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure, my pleasure. Glad to have you. So we've had a chance to talk before, and I think we got pretty deep into some crop-specific discussions and dialogues, and today I'm hoping to keep it a little bit more 10,000-foot level.
Okay.
Does that sound fair?
Sounds fair to me.
So this first part, I'm going to throw out some words, some phrases, and I just want you to give me your first gut reaction to what you're thinking about. And then I'm going to come back and touch on each one of them.
Sounds great.
Fair? All right. Let's roll. Okay. Genetic diversity.
Driver of plant breeding.
Driver of plant breeding. I like it. Plant breeders' rights and royalties.
Necessary and also a way of funding our future.
Okay. And then research funding.
Research funding needs to be focused and probably needs to be increased.
Scientific advancement.
It's progress.
And last but certainly not least, social media.
A great way of communicating with people very quickly.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to jump into this. So for social media, you said great, quick way to connect with people. Why is that the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, in my state, most of my growers actually are on Twitter. Right. And so when we see a new disease or there's a disease in Kansas that we expect to come to Nebraska, I can get it out to my growers almost instantaneously. And so they'll be prepared. And when you think about if you had to do a television interview or you had to do a newspaper interview, the lag time. So to me, I just love the instantaneous. I keep all my social media for wheat purely business.
Okay. And so it doesn't have any of your own personal pieces. You keep that separate.
Well, I keep that separate, but what you retweet does show your bias.
Right.
So I'm always interested in feeding people, so there's a lot of retweets about hunger and things like that.
Excellent. Good for you. So social media, is it helping or hurting or hindering or supporting plant breeding?
Well, to me, it would depend. It certainly can do either. Okay. There are certain things like the wheat belly, which I find scientifically incorrect. That's not helping us. But the ability to get sound science out quickly is definitely helping us.
If we try to look at what can the industry do to actually help that cause, any thoughts, any ideas on what could be done?
Well, I personally love some of the things the industries have done. The American Seed Trade Association, Crop Life, a number of these types of things have put out some really beautiful short videos that you can retweet and people can see what we do. FAO is full of statistics that can help us talk about what things are. Things like just this morning I saw a tweet, 2.5% of all the water in the world is fresh water. Think about how precious that is.
Yeah, isn't that the truth?
And would you know that if you didn't see that? Probably not. I wouldn't.
Right, and certainly not on that massive a scope.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So switching now, your response to research funding was focused and needs to increase.
Yeah. To me, I guess when I look at research funding, it's like eating your seed corn. If you're not investing in research, you're not investing in your future. And so that's where I come from. Now, you have to figure out what's the right level. You have to pick priorities. There will never be enough money for everything. But at the same time, you have to make sure you're not eating the seed corn, the things which are absolutely critical.
Right. How does that compare at the state versus federal level?
It varies. The federal level usually works at things which the federal government has decided are important, so they're more at the 10,000-foot level. The state level often works at a level of what do we have to do immediately? What are the local problems? And so there's a great need for a blend of both.
How does that compare to the rest of the world? I mean, you get to travel, you get to talk to lots of folks from around the world. How does it compare?
Well, if you're certainly in a food insecure area, the percentage of research investment in agriculture is much higher. Actually, if you're in Europe, which is a food secure area, their investment in research is much higher. England has an agricultural economy about the size of Iowa, and it spends, I think, 4 or more times more money on agriculture than we do, federal and state, in Iowa.
Right. How does this concept of we all have to do our part, how does that fit together in this funding model?
Well, so first of all, let me make sure I understand the question. You're thinking about, we all have to do our part. Usually when I hear that, it's someone saying budgets are tight, we've got a deficit, we've all got to tighten our belts.
Exactly.
Okay. Again, are you willing to eat your seed corn?
Right.
And so my point is, you know, they always talk about budgets are tight. They always talk about what we have, and they never put that in a, you know, they look at it as a revenue situation. They never look at it as a tax situation. So if you cut taxes massively and you create a budget shortfall, is that really the issue when it comes to research funding? Do you still not need it?
Right.
So some of that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't like paying taxes, then the answer is you don't like investing, and you don't like investing in the things that are critical, and that shows.
Well said. So I'm curious, if you were asked to testify in front of Congress, what would be some of your key talking points?
A key talking point would be, if you want to grow the economy, you don't do it without investment. And so you think about it. When you look at tax reform, what do they try to do? They try to increase avenues for investment for future growth. If you're going to fund public research, you should be looking at it the same way. It's an investment for future growth. So if I were testifying to Congress, it's the question of simply this. You have a tax policy that you want to have to enhance growth? Do you have a public research policy that you want to enhance growth? They both cost money. And you can do it lots of different ways. You can actually incentivize public research funding by giving tax breaks to private corporations to fund public research. Again, it's just, what are you willing to invest in?
Right, and what's your focus?
And what is your focus?
Right, absolutely. When I mentioned plant breeders' rights and royalties, you said necessary. That's the word that stuck in my head, is necessary. Can you elaborate a little bit on your thoughts there?
I think what happens here is, in plant breeding, there's a spectrum from public to private sector. The private sector definitely must have plant breeders' rights so they can get a return on their investment. I mean, who would write a book if everybody could go to a copy center and copy the book and the author would never get a royalty, never get any of that? So there's a definite need for that intellectual property and the protection of plant breeders' rights. In the public sector, more and more, because we do create things with great economic value, we're funding the public programs a lot, not completely by any way, shape, or form, but certainly supplementing them with that same form of royalties.
Absolutely. And we've gone a long ways. We've got a couple of treaties in place, international treaties in place now, that have had a big impact on our industry. What's missing in there to allow plant breeders to do their work internationally?
You know, I think the treaties are good frameworks. They're at the 100,000-foot level, and what you need is the reduction to practice. And so there's a lot of things. One of the things you're going to talk about at this meeting is there's a big effort on intellectual property rights. And I really support it because almost every tech transfer office in the public sector is used to patents, and only the best ones with scholarship and creativity understand that there are other models that relate to seed.
Right.
And so you often get a one-size-fits-all, patent-only tech transfer office that has no concept of how agriculture really fits, or limited concept, and poor scholarship on that.
Is that getting better, in your opinion, that understanding, or not so much?
You know, it is getting better. It's a slow progress, okay? I expect that we'll still see cases of universities which will develop a policy based exclusively on patents and not understand the uniqueness or really how other people have approached the very same question just because they haven't done their scholarship, which at a university I think is highly questionable if you're not doing scholarship.
Absolutely, absolutely. So on genetic diversity, you said driving plant breeding.
Yeah. The bottom line is this: if you don't have variation, which is genetic diversity, another name for genetic diversity, you can't make progress. Everything that you have that relates to plant breeding starts with putting genetic diversity into the system in some way, whether that's through crosses, through mutations, through transgenics, everything. It all starts with variation. If there's no genetic variation, there will be zero progress in plant breeding.
And speaking of progress, for scientific advancement, you said progress.
Yeah.
What's your thought there?
I always feel that if you want to create the world that you want to live in, I mean, every generation hopes to make a better world for the next generation. You need progress. And scientific advancement is the way of doing that. You know, when I first started out, the computer I would do my data analysis on would be the size of a small room. Everything was done in punch cards, things like that. The techniques we have, the molecular tools we have, problems that we approached and had to walk away. I'm very interested in hybrid wheat. We couldn't have done it in the 80s the way we can do it now. And so that progress allows us to create whole new opportunities, whole new abilities to feed people, which, you know, we're increasing our population, we're increasing our wealth. The demand on the food system is only going to get larger. We need that progress.
So now I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball a little bit. What do you see plant breeding being able to accomplish in the next 5 to 10 years, and how will that compare to the last 5 to 10 years?
Okay, so first of all, for most plant breeders, the scope is, if you're a winter annual, is 12 years.
Right.
And if you're a spring annual breeder, it's 7 years.
Right.
Okay? So in the next 5 years, whatever we're going to see progress is what we're doing now.
Right.
And 10 years, we'll see a little difference.
Is it going to be light year steps, though, or is it going to be incremental steps, still? I guess that's where I was kind of taking it.
If you look at it, what I would say is agriculture is immensely robust. And I think, to me, things like the Green Revolution, which to some might look like a light year advance, was in fact the logical conclusion of very good, sound research that led forward. So the question is, do we need a second Green Revolution? Absolutely. Will we get it in 5 to 10 years? If not in 5 to 10, I expect we'll get it within 15 to 20. And so looking down the road, we will understand our genetic variation much better. We will be able to induce it and use it much better. What we're seeing with the new technologies in gene editing like CRISPR, Cas9, I think will be phenomenal. I don't think we've even touched that. So the sky is large and the view will be great. So I'm very optimistic.
Awesome.
Now, will it happen in 5 years? That's a short time span for breeding.
So, Stephen, you get leaned on a lot within the plant breeding sector to be a spokesperson, to be able to tell the story of plant breeding because you're good at it.
I hope I am.
And I'm curious, what would you tell your colleagues who some perhaps don't necessarily see the merits of being outspoken and talking about the topic and sharing their story and their information? What would your words of wisdom be to them?
Well, my words of wisdom would be to ask yourself why you got into this field. In my case, it's easy. I got in to feed people. What I learned is that people will be fed when society decides to feed them. And so all I can do is actually provide them with the tools so that when they decide to feed everyone, when they decide it's no longer acceptable to have 800 million people go to bed hungry, they can have that capability.
Right.
If that's your passion, and find out what your passion is, you should speak to it. In my case, it's to feed people. It's a very social goal. It's an investment that I think most people are in favor of. You have to talk to that. Now, if you have a completely different view, you know, your goal is to be the greatest scientist and your impact you're not interested in, then maybe this isn't the right place. And in part because I don't think you can communicate perhaps as easily as to what the impact is, which I think is what tugs the heartstrings of the human soul.
Absolutely. Well said, sir. Thanks very much, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.